Hello, everybody, and sorry for that hiccup at the beginning of today's session. Just to repeat what I just said aloud to myself, I am Dr. Philippa Hellowell. I am Head of Collections Research at the National Archives. I want to extend a very warm welcome to Talking Records, which is our new yearly symposium organised by the Collections Research team at the National Archives. The symposium follows a year of internal research events that researchers at the National Archives have organised to understand how pollution and histories of pollution have been inscribed, deposited, and recorded in our National Archives. Following a day of presentations and records displays at our site in Kew, London yesterday, today we're going to hear from speakers around the globe. This afternoon, we'll have two panels of speakers exploring the histories of pollution in archival collections. And I will now pass over to my colleague, Heather Craddock, to explain the format of this afternoon's sessions.
Thank you very much, Philippa. I'm Heather Craddock. I'm a collections researcher at the National Archives. I'm just going to run us through a few bits of housekeeping before we make a start. So this session will include two panels. The first panel will finish at around 3:15 UK time, and the second panel will finish at around 4:30 UK time. We'll begin by hearing from our presenters, and at the end of their papers, there'll be a Q&A session where you'll have the opportunity to ask them any questions you might have. This event is being run through Zoom webinar, meaning you can ask questions by submitting them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please submit your questions at any point throughout the session today, and we'll come back to them during the Q&A portions of each panel. My colleagues will be sharing some guidance regarding the Q&A function in the chat. If you need any technical support during the event, please reach out to them via the chat and they will assist you. Please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube in due course. We've also enabled live captions. You can access these at the bottom of your screen by clicking live transcript, show subtitle, or alternatively, you can hide these if you find them distracting by following the same process. So to start us off on our first panel, we're going to be hearing today about histories of local and global cases of environmental pollution in our first session. In the second panel, we'll hear some reflections on how archival records can shape environmental accountability. So firstly, before we make a start, please do introduce yourself in the chat and let us know why you're joining us today and where from, and feel free to share any projects focusing on pollution and archives. So to begin our first panel, I'd like to introduce Paul Wright, who is a civil servant within the UK's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, where he researches and advises on environmental policy. He's also a visiting researcher at the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at Newcastle University, where he focuses on the geographies of awkward heritage and the historiography of archive research. He has built an interest in how landscapes and the traversing of landscapes embody uncomfortable, awkward narratives of the past, such as histories of failure, guilt, stress, and precarity, and how people stitch those narratives into places. He's currently the conference officer for Historical Geography Research Group of the RHS, and he leads their Porous Archives series of events. He'll be presenting today on nuclear perpetrations through the thoughtful landscapes of the Ururi National Park. So over to you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Heather and colleagues, Heather, Philippa, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. I first of all would like to ask Heather and Philippa just to wave at me if you can both see my slides and hear me. All good. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to be here, and thank you for the invite. It's pronounced Uriri, I think. And if anyone is joining me here from Wales, as this research project progresses, I will make every effort to learn more and better Welsh. And it's a very slow burning project. Please do bear with me. But if you're joining me here today from Wales, I'm sorry I cannot address you in Welsh. Hopefully, in the near-ish future, if I were to present this again, I may be able to at least introduce myself in Welsh. But right now, it would be embarrassing, and I'll probably inadvertently declare war on a small country somewhere due to how poor my skills are. So, nuclear perpetrations in the thoughtful landscapes of Harare National Park. If you've had a quick glance at my abstract, you will know that I'm building this short presentation around a fundamental idea and a fundamental pushing back against an idea, I should say, that's prevalent in landscape research, and that is that if a landscape is ruined or spoiled in some way or other, it is because the perpetration against it is by a thoughtless addition to that landscape, which pays no heed to, or does not align with, or does not in some way gently mimic the existing appearance of or features of that landscape. Now, as you look on screen here, what you're looking at is Llyn. It's a lake in the middle of Snowdonia National Park, which of course now is Eryri National Park. It's formerly Snowdonia, it's now just Eryri. And you see in the background, the left-hand side there, the Sylvan Dam. You see on the right-hand side one of the Mulwins. And if I just go to the next slide and get rid of the title, you also see the 2 reactor halls of Trasfynydd nuclear power station. This landscape, or at least the images of it, which I'm able to share, and these are all from Creative Commons, by the way, so they're all licensable and reusable, and you can reuse them as you wish. This landscape is important because it takes a lot of talking yourself into. It takes a lot of narrative, which and takes a lot of work to believe a narrative that allows you to build a nuclear power station in what was at the time a recently established national park. And one of the real joys about doing this project is that there is some extremely compelling archive content, and only one piece of that content I'm going to be sharing with you in little nuggets today. And the little nuggets I will share with you are from the public inquiry. And we'll see that on the next slide shortly. The public inquiry, which is archived at the National Archive, and the University of Southampton very kindly made it available via the Internet Archive a few years ago on digital scan. And what's very, very interesting is that the whole history, the whole notion of how a group of people come to convince themselves that what you see in front of you is okay. And I don't rule out that it might be okay, how they actually convince themselves that it should be the case. Now, it's always the case, it's commonly the case in landscape research and landscape thinking in general, that thoughtlessness leads to what you see in front of you here. To place 2 buildings like that, and they are large buildings, all those small windows you see on the left-hand side of the reactor halls, they're about 1.5 stories equivalent. So the entire thing is it's big. It's big, and there's 2 of them. There's also a very large turbine hall to the right here, which is partially hidden. It's much lower lying, but kind of bigger and flatter. And the public inquiry, I think, is a remarkable document, a remarkable piece of a remarkable archival finding, if you will, that tells us a lot about how the individuals involved in making what you see in front of you happen talk to themselves and discourse to themselves into it, and convince themselves, in fact, that what they were doing had a degree of care. It wasn't simple thoughtlessness. It wasn't just that I want a nuclear power station, I found a handy location, I'm going to put it here and give it no further thought. So I want to challenge this notion in landscape research that what you see in front of you is thoughtless. In fact, because it was going into a national park, and because the placing of it would be understandably quite raw, then in fact quite a lot of careful thought and quite a lot of care went into the placing of this. Now, we're going to have a quick look at what that care looks like. And then at the end of this presentation, I'm going to go over in more detail exactly what I'm hoping to do with this project next in what's going to be a porous archives approach. So this is the front page of the public inquiry of 1958, the 12th, the 13th and the 14th of February. It was inspected by Mr. Grimmett of the Ministry of Power and Mr. Buchanan of the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, as was. Okay, so let's just start by emphasising how very, very different a public inquiry into building a nuclear power station in the middle of a national park looks, or looked, I should say, in 1958 compared to what it might look like in 2025. It's two lads, 3 days in one village hall. This actually took place in the village hall in Strathfirnith itself, the small village, which in the previous photograph is kind of hidden off to the right on a small bluff. So that is what a public inquiry into something huge looked like. 3 days. Now, obviously, there was a body of work preceding this 3 days, and people had been engaged with, and the submissions to the inquiry had been collated. But if we start with this big difference, but also a cautionary note about what a public inquiry looks like into something of this magnitude and something of this seriousness in 1958. But we also must remember that it's very easy to go into archival research with this notion of, oh, let's look at how mad stuff was in like the 1950s and the 1960s. Let's look at something with that kind of unpleasant kind of temporal superiority of the now and how we'd never do anything like this again. But as we'll see as we go through, things were different. And it's not just that people hadn't kind of advanced their thought in 1958. I would argue that actually the way they thought this through was as advanced, if not more advanced, in how we think about landscape and how we add things to landscape now. But the key thing is that they were facing significant challenges that we don't deal with in the same way now. Now, this is going to be one of those annoying presentations where there's large quantities of text that I've copy-pasted from the document parked in a slide, and I do not expect you to read this live. I would hope that you can swing back to this at a later point, and as it's going onto YouTube, you should be able to hit pause. But these three, we start with these three extracts here and the linearity of experience. In the opening pages to the public inquiry document, one of the most interesting things that we see is that the entire notion of the landscape around Strathfirnith, which is in the middle of Eryri National Park, is generated from roads, specifically the A487, which goes in a kind of a south to north direction, and the B4391, which comes in from the east and bisects the northern side of Llyn and there's lots of stuff on the right-hand side here for you to indulge yourselves with after the fact, and I hope you do. But fundamentally, when the members of the inquiry were saying, well, what's this landscape like? How good is this landscape? How much do we like it? Their frame of reference was, what's it like in terms of travelling along these two roads? At what point would the power station appear? What would it look like when it does appear? How long is it in our line of sight for? What about the transmission lines? How long are they in our line of sight? How do they appear as a driver going down the road? Not footpaths, not someone standing on the peaks necessarily. They do cover that to a degree, but there's a lot in the, at least in the opening pages of the public inquiry, about how the landscape looks from the road. So immediately there's a preferential frame for understanding the landscape, not the landscape in lots of different notions from lots of different angles, but from this one specific angle, and also specific directions. On the A487, it was discussed travelling from Dolgelly in the south towards Blanafestyn in the north. On the B4391, it was discussed as travelling as if from Bala in the east towards Mattenrog in the Vale of Festiniog in the west. So it was even directional. So how these individuals started to convince themselves that Strathfirnith would fit and work, and how they started that kind of act of care was, in a sense, somewhat careless. It was to limit themselves to being road travellers in their imagination. And that's a very interesting finding. I'm going to intersperse these I know these are big blocks of text, so I'll occasionally stick in further images of nuclear power stations looking attractive and moody. This is Strathfirnith, looking attractive and moody, a photograph from 1972 on a misty winter's day. So, as we get further into the inquiry document, the notion of care is immediately expanded beyond the notion of care for landscape. Immediately, other considerations are mixed in, and the landscape damaged is contextualized against bigger, more urgent needs, or at least equally urgent needs that need to be weighed one against the other. We start at the top here with the observation that the demand for electricity in the UK in the late 1950s, heading into the 1960s, is increasing at a huge rate. In the second extract here, we note that the main means the UK had at the time of generating electricity was coal. And there were certain areas that had a lot of coal and therefore generated a lot of electricity. There were other areas that didn't have a lot of coal and either had to have their electricity shipped in on the national grid, or they had to generate by some other means. The third extract here is really interesting. The geography of Trasfynydd is not considered in the context of this report as strictly in North Wales. Either Meirionydd, which is the district, or Gwynedd, which is the current day county, is considered as being in the Manchester grid control area. So Trasfynydd would have been one of a network of power stations which fed into the combined appetite for electricity of North Cheshire, Manchester, Chester itself, Stockport, other areas around urban Manchester, as well as, for example, Conwy, Blennerfestiniog, Portmaddock, and other towns immediately around the Trasfynydd site. So, and the observation here is that the amount of coal this area produces is 2.5 million tonnes per year, but it needs 9.5 million tonnes beyond that to generate the electricity it needs. So therefore, it makes sense to place nuclear power here in this coal deficient area. So then as you see, the notion of, is it okay? Is it okay to put Trasfynydd here in Trasfynydd? Is it okay to build 490 megawatts of nuclear capacity next to this lake in the middle of a national park? And the answer is that you can see themselves kind of trying to train their discourse towards a yes initially. And the bottom quote here is really interesting from Mr. T.W. Jones, the MP from Meirionyddshire, as was boundaries have changed since. And of course, there were no assembly members back then. He argues there's a unanimity in the desire for a nuclear station in North Wales because the population, certainly in the nearest town, Blennerfestiniog, has fallen from 14,000 to 7,000. There's an anxiety to preserve the Welsh way of life, which, he says, and this is the closing line here, is more important than scenic beauty, and the way of life could not be preserved if the population continued to decline. So there's all kinds of other reasons here to say if there is going to be landscape damage, there are good reasons, there are noble reasons for having the landscape take this hit. And so as we go through the inquiry, this notion of noble sacrifice kind of slowly kind of increases. How do we make Trasfynydd bearable? Well, we start at the top here by saying it's not as big as something that's bigger, which is a really obvious point. But say, well, Trasfynydd, which would cover an area of 180 acres, and it's not that big. It's not going to be as big as the oil refinery in South Wales at Milton Haven, which is 2,800 acres. At this point, you can kind of hear them perhaps clutching at straws. They also note, the individuals in the inquiry, that there's nowhere that it says, and this is true, it's still the case, that you are not allowed to develop industry in a national park. The UK's national parks are different from many other countries in that respect. They also note that actually a forestry panel for the National Park Planning Committee have been assessing whether, how good different areas are for kind of forestry, whether they can simply accept kind of industrial forestry or whether they need to be more sensitively dealt with. And they say that the forestry panel has found that the area of Trasfynydd is the least sensitive place. So they immediately grab that and run with it. If this particular panel has said it's not sensitive, then I assume if it can take commercial forestry, it can take, and this is a bit of a leap, to nuclear reactors. They then say, well, look at the surroundings. It's big, but there's big stuff around it. The Rhinogs, the Molwins, the Alanigs. There's large kind of craggy mountains and large kind of outcrops surrounding this. It is it is placed amongst big things, so it'll be in good company. There's a good company argument, and you see, it's not an absence of care, but it is a very particular, a very arguably wishful, arguably naive articulation of care. And then finally, the closing point here is that it's a nuclear power station. It's clean. It won't chuck out smoke. There won't be constant deliveries of coal. There won't be big coal heaps, and it will be quiet. There it is from another angle. Actually, as you see, it does vent steam. The steam you see coming from the top of the reactor halls, which are behind the turbine hall in this image, that's condensation from the air being drawn around the reactor shells. I'm aware I'm approaching time here, so I'll just rattle through the rest of these slides nice and quickly. Just for contrast, this is Hunterston. This is another nuclear power station that was built around about the same time in Ayrshire. Behind it is Hunterston B. Look at the difference in the architecture. That's Trasfynydd. It's quite monolithic. It's not extensively glazed. It has some massing on its elevations. And whereas this is very much a cathedral of light, you can just about see the boilers through the glazed exterior. The conical structures, the two reactor halls are kind of conjoined cylinders, if you were. Oh, I'll just backwards and forwards again. There's quite a difference. Now, there's a whole rich kind of archival sources beyond the inquiry. They include the architect's elevations, the architect's ideas, and the landscape architect as well. Sylvia Crowe was a landscape architect, an absolute giant in her field. Sir Basil Spence was the architect, an absolute giant in his field. This isn't the end of how Trasfynydd was cared its way into the landscape. But as you can see, it's a notion which people are trying to care for something and trying to exercise care in adding this thing to the landscape, and trying to also evade the fact that it is a substantial imposition. And on this final slide of text, or almost this final slide of text, you can see, and you're welcome to come back and have a look at how in various different ways different members of the inquiry said, well, this needs yet more care. The care you've attempted to deploy here is not careful enough. It is not enough care, and you will need to do more. And if you were to look at the middle quote there, I'll just read this back. The effect of the proposal and its value to the national park depends on the appreciation of the landscape as a whole, seen from many points of view. The eye should be, and a casual glance from the level of the road utterly failed to do justice to the scene. I quite like this one. It takes one of the key notions from earlier in the inquiry and starts to shut down the notion that your care can be articulated solely from the A road and the B road that transect the site. I will skip over this side, but safe to say that in a different earlier Act of Parliament, and this is quoted at the bottom here, there is a pre-existing notion of care that, and this was when hydroelectric schemes, earlier schemes were being built before Trasfynydd in the same area, that you could make dams, aqueducts, bridge wall embankments, spoil heaps and so forth inconspicuous. So there was a notion already in existence that to extend care, that the additions to the landscape could be in some way made inconspicuous. So that kind of already existed. So I close this by detailing what I would like to do next. It's all very well me sitting here indulgently saying, "Oh, I found something amazing in the archives. Isn't it brilliant?" It has an amazing kind of narrative of people convincing themselves that they're about to avoid something harmful, or that they can downplay the harm, or that they can re-articulate the harm in some way that's been done to a landscape. But what I want to do is take some of the stuff you saw in the previous slides, and I want to actually take it here, where you see on screen, to the reactor halls, to Llyn itself, and the local communities and the visitors. And I would like to walk around with them and say, you see the different notions of care and the sometimes wishful notions of care, and arguably some of the silly notions of care here in the inquiry. And perhaps you see them also in some of the later documents and some of the later drawings from the architects and the planners, which I can add to this. Does it make you appreciate this landscape differently? Because just to be clear, up until very recently, Trasfynydd has been seen as a perpetration landscape. It's been seen as a landscape for which harm has been done, which an act of thoughtless despolation has been done. But as you see from what I've just presented, it may be wishful, it may be arguably silly. It's definitely not thoughtless. And I've done this before. Let's just show these quick slides here. I have taken archival material with volunteers, researchers, and mapped it around Newcastle upon Tyne. This was a diary of a First World War munitions worker who kept substantial diaries, and we took these and we kind of emplaced this archival content around where she walked around Newcastle upon Tyne. And we said, well, what difference does it make to have the archive taken from its point of origin and emplaced around? Knowing that someone thought about the landscape this way, does it change how it means to you? That is a key question I would ask. And this, by the way, is the archive. This is the particular diary entry which this refers to. And with that, noting that I'm a full 2 minutes over, sorry, Heather, sorry, Philippa, I would like to just close by saying there is actually a Porous Archives conference series currently going on the 12th of December. So it's a week today. The Porous Archives 2, the second Porous Archives conference, is being held online and in person at Newcastle University. Want to come? You want to hear more about porous archives, how they could be used? Do you want to come and give me a kicking because of my notions in this particular presentation? You're very more than welcome to just quickly scan that QR code down there. Make it quick because I'm about to stop sharing. But with that, I'd like to hand back to Heather and Philippa here with my extended thanks for this opportunity to speak to you, and my apologies for rambling on for what is now, wait for it, 3 minutes too long. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was excellent. There's some really beautiful images there. And I personally love seeing large blocks of archive text on a slide. So I think you're sharing that with the right audience here. Some really interesting descriptions of the landscape in those quotations that you showed us as well. So I hope we can come back to that a little bit more in the Q&A. And I also personally loved the map of Newcastle that you managed to squeeze in there, as that is where I was born and raised. So thank you very much, Paul. We'll move on to our next speaker in just a moment. Just a reminder to put any of your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen now. You can pop them in for Paul, and as we go on throughout this panel, and we'll come back to them at the end. So next, we're going to hear from Andrew Craig, who is a PhD candidate and instructor in the history department at the University of Georgia in the US. He's originally from Asheville, North Carolina, and he received his BA in history from UNC Chapel Hill and his master's from UNC Wilmington. His dissertation project, which he'll continue to write while in residence at the University of Oxford this spring, focuses on the development of chemical fertilizers in the post-Civil War US and environmentalism during the Jim Crow era. Andrew has kindly pre-recorded his presentation for us on mapping the vast fecal resources of the archives, which we'll play now. Thank you.
Multiple archives in Athens, Georgia hold in their collections a booklet titled Seed Time and Harvest. I started to discover this booklet scattered across archival collections in January and February 2022, as I was starting to find a new way of exploring old ideas during the second semester of my PhD program at the University of Georgia. I first encountered this rather unassuming booklet on the day that January when I met Tom Hodgson for the first time, who was the great-grandson of Prince Hodgson, or Edward Reginald Hodgson, president of the Empire State Chemical Company. Perhaps it's needless to say as I'm showing it to you now, but it's a document that has fascinated me almost daily since I first held it in the picture here. First published in 1910, Seed Time and Harvest was carried that year throughout northeast Georgia by the Rural Free Delivery Service, which had been recently established thanks in large part to the agitation of populists in the state, like firebrand Tom Watson. Its pages offered the region's struggling cotton farmers a special invitation from Prince to join the, quote, Empire State Chemical Company's Union Lodge 23, otherwise known as the Red Star Special Optimist Club, which, according to Prince, was helping to facilitate a, quote, revolution in agriculture, end quote, across what he called the true Empire State of the South. The Optimist Club's goal was almost as simple as joining. Prince wrote that one of the first things a farmer must swear when he joins this Optimist Club is that he believes the Bible rings true when it says, quote, seed time and harvest shall not cease. That's right. Revolutions in agriculture cannot come in a day, but step by step. Day by day, more and more of our good and true men who till the soil are coming to know and to believe a plant can be fed and nourished just like a cow, horse, or pig. We do not leave our animals unfed, nor should we leave our plants unfed. Some people turn their pigs out into the woods, where they can gather acorns and tell them to root or die, but generally these are of the razorback variety. Most of the members of our club, most members of the Optimist Club, feed their hogs and likewise their cotton, corn, wheat, and oats. I first became interested in companies like Prince Hodgson's Empire State Chemical Company and the role that these companies played in facilitating the, quote, revolutions in agriculture that he wrote about while working on my master's thesis. Initially, my plan was to write a history of environmentalism in the Tillery community of North Carolina. There, a community of activists had emerged and grown after a series of extreme weather events in the 1990s, caused waste lagoons on concentrated hog feeding operations, or CAFOs, to spill into numerous rural communities. These spills not only contaminated entire watersheds and resulted in algae blooms that killed large portions of the aquaculture there, but they also highlighted the concerns of residents like Gary Grant, who had been raising concerns about public health and hog waste management practices in predominantly black communities down south, like Tillery, where pork producers had built an increasing number of hog CAFOs since the 1970s at the encouragement of authorities across local, state, and federal levels. As I worked to navigate both public health precautions surrounding COVID-19 and associated archival closures, I found myself spending most of the pandemic shut down reviewing and analyzing digitized documents, like The Reconstructed Farmer, published by James Thigpen, starting in 1869 from Tarboro, North Carolina, which is in the same county, Edgecombe, where Tillery is located. The thesis that I eventually wrote centered largely around the development of swine science and CAFOs in North Carolina, from the moment that men like Thigpen started to promote them and started to hire men like Albert Reed Ladeau to help institutionalize this idea of scientific agriculture. Using records that I gained access to thanks to the kindness of the North Carolina State University Special Collections Library and Archives, who in January 2021, amidst archival closures, allowed me special one-day access after I provided multiple letters from the University of Wilmington's Dean Department of History, as well as proof of my own clean bill of health. They allowed me access to the records of swine scientists in the mid-20th century, as well as the records of other agricultural chemists at the state experiment station. Using the records of swine scientists in the mid-20th century in particular, I showed how the foundational work of Ladeau in establishing the North Carolina Agricultural Experiment Station in the 1870s, based on the model that he had witnessed in Germany while studying geology and chemistry as a graduate student there, and while he was testing the, quote, superphosphate chemical manures that had in part been the impetus for the experiment station's founding, had laid the works for what later became swine science, as well as more intensive methods of pork production like CAFOs. As well as digging through the archives of agricultural scientists and chemists in the North Carolina Department of Agriculture from around the turn of the century, then I started noticing mentions of phosphate fertilizer companies like the Navassa Guano Company of Wilmington. It didn't take long as I started to dig more into these companies before I started to notice overlapping discourses, concerns raised in protest from rural black activists surrounding the long-term presence of toxic waste, communities that had once been home to phosphate fertilizer factories, or in some cases were now home to hog CAFOs. So admittedly, I was nervous the first time I pulled up to Tom's. He was standing there at his grandfather's house, where he now lived, chatting with Peggy Gallus, whom my advisor had introduced me to, in order to introduce me to Tom. He was standing with Peggy wearing his Georgia Poultry Association hat, an interest group that I was familiar with in part to my MA advisor's book, which charted the development of industrial chicken farming in Georgia and poultry CAFOs there. It was a group that gave me as much pause as the North Carolina Pork Producers Association. So as he was standing there feeding his prize hens, offering his hand out to shake mine, my palm was quite sweaty and my heart was pounding. Questions raced through my head about whether Tom would be willing to give me access to his family's extensive archive should he find out that much of my interest in agricultural history lay in the environmental justice movements and changes in environmental consciousness based on the, quote, modernization or industrialization of agriculture in the region in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sure enough, when we sat down at his table, the first question Tom had prepped and ready for me as he introduced the multiple boxes of archival materials and set them in front of me was whether or not I was there to give his family, quote, a bad name. Luckily, after spending an hour or so chatting with Tom and patiently walking him through the story of how it arrived at his kitchen table, he continued welcoming me there over the next 6 weeks. The papers I read and photographed there mostly detailed his grandfather Ned's extensive tours abroad in 1908 and 1918. It's this particular body, correspondence, business memos, ledgers, stock certificates, maps, and other ephemera that have helped me plot the course of my doctoral research, a journey that has now taken me to over a dozen archives and 3 continents over the last 4 years, as I've worked to understand not only the Empire State Chemical Company better, but companies like it, and how the history of these companies increasingly reshaped agricultural production, global consumer habits, and more importantly, the ecology of places like the U.S. South. Every day that I left Tom's house and the dozens of days after that I spent reviewing the what amassed to thousands of pages that I'd scanned in his family's archive. My list of questions about the SCC and Ned's 1908 tour, particularly the stops that he'd made to see ambassadors, Chilean nitrate mine managers, touring Peruvian guano islands and German potash pits, as well as to meet the British Phosphate Promotional Syndicate, grew longer and longer. It took months of working in other archives, ranging from Tom's brother Paul's cabin, where he also had a private archive of ESCC papers, as well as UGA's Hargret Special Collections and Rare Books Library, the Athens-Clarke County Library Historical Room, and reviewing those documents as well before I started to get a better picture of why Ned had taken this tour. It took even longer, though, of sorting through these documents to begin to get a picture of why the family generally had used the capital they inherited over the course of 3 generations to go from coach manufacturers to cotton merchants and then to agrochemical entrepreneurs. Trying to make sense of the associated company ledgers and other documents amidst the correspondence shared between Ned and Mary on his tours, it was one of my first archival voyages beyond the Hodgson family archive, in which I read about the injunction in 1913 that kept the factory shuttered for several weeks. It was that summer that a chemical runoff from routine seasonal maintenance leached into the surrounding watershed and into the Oconee River, resulting in a fish kill that clogged power-generating mill works downstream at the Athens Manufacturing Cotton Mill, one of the city's leading businesses at the time. As a new set of questions started to coalesce around what I found in Harry Hodgson's scrapbook at the Hargret Library regarding this injunction in 1913 that kept the factory from operating, I set out to understand the manufacturing process that they used better in order to understand the environmental damage that it had caused. As I started to think on how I might tackle this issue and find records that would help me, I was immediately drawn back again to Seed Time and Harvest, where I remember one of the few images printed there of the interior of the factory. In that image, you can see the machinery of the Hodgsons used. And there you can see embossed on the crushers, Pratt Engineering. It only took a simple search in Hargret's catalog to find another set of letter books kept by chemist Nathaniel Adolphus Pratt between 1864 and the mid-1870s. It was during this time that Pratt was chief chemist of the Confederate States Snyder and Mining Bureau, which was detailed in the first letter book. The second letter book details Pratt's efforts to gain investors to build a factory that would use the process he developed alongside other Confederate scientists like Joseph LeConte to convert waste, night soil, and other mineral deposits in the region into niter and saltpeter for munitions amidst the U.S. wartime blockade of Confederate state ports into superphosphate fertilizers, which he argued after the war would restore the prosperity of southern plantations without the necessity of enslaved labor. With a little digging, I was able to find records related to the Pratt Engineering Company of Atlanta, Georgia. Eventually, as I was struggling to wrangle all the archival data that I was starting to amass between sorting out the Pratt process, the history of the Empire State Chemical Company, and all of these other companies that I was encountering along the way, I started to work with Steve Berry, Claudio Sant, and Scott Nelson, all members of the UGA History Department faculty who have worked extensively with digital humanities. They helped me start to map the fertilizer industry in the South between 1868, the year when the first of Pratt's factories became operational in Charleston, in 1920, when chemical manures like the ones that he had developed started to change dramatically after what Vaclav Smil calls the nitrogen revolution. I used the Federal Trade Commission report pictured here, which was commissioned by the Senate in the early 1910s on the fertilizer industry, as well as contemporary Sanborn fire maps to historically geolocate the fertilizer factories that it mentioned. In doing so, I came to understand both the Hodgson's fertilizer business and how it developed in comparison to their regional and national competitors, as well as the role that Southern fertilizer companies like ESCC, the Virginia Carolina Chemical Company, and F.S. Royster & Co. played in reshaping the ways humans around the globe during the early 20th century understood their relationship to nature. It was my work mapping Nathaniel Pratt's letter books in the CSA Nitrogen Mining Bureau's Night Soil Collection campaign that brought me to the UK in October 2023 to present at the Mare Dolores conference at SOAS in London. There I presented with two other UGA grad students from the history department on the history of human waste disposal in the post-Civil War South. This presented all of us, but me in particular, with an important opportunity to recreate some of the exploratory expeditions that I'd read about Southern chemists like Pratt, LeConte, and Ledoux taking in the mid to late 19th century to understand how European research institutions were going about making fertilizer. My British archival tour started in Liverpool, a couple of weeks before the conference. My first stop was the Liverpool Records Office. There I was able to explore the papers of the Liverpool Cotton Brokers Association, as well as other individuals, firms, and institutions that had played a role in developing the trade of guano and phosphates. My next stop was the Sidney Jones Library, where I was able to further explore British trading firms' impressions of American merchants and would-be American fertilizer manufacturers. My co-panelists and I also took a trip to the National Archives when we visited the UK in 2023, and it was on this stop of my tour that I was able to finally locate a huge stack of bound documents related to the various iterations of the British Guano Promotion Syndicate, which was one of the entities that Ned Hodgson went searching for in 1908. My archival tour in 2023 also took me to the Rothamsted Research Library. There I was able to explore the papers of Lawes Gilbert, who had created the foundational model that Ledoux and others used in the US to create agricultural experiment stations in America. Most intriguing to me, perhaps, were the multiple bundles of correspondence I found to Gilbert from the directors of state experiment stations in the US. My archival tour of the UK in 2023 laid the foundations for the archival research that I did this summer, each day over the 6 weeks that I spent as a junior dean in residence at Trinity College with the UGA Oxford program. I visited one of the Bodleian libraries, most often the Weston Library, where I continued to explore the development of manuring practices, British organized phosphate companies. While in residence at Oxford, I was also able to take the train down to Reading to visit the Museum of English Rural Life. There, I was able to consult the collections of the Lawes Chemical Manure Company, which, in the same way Rothamsted Research had become a model for American agricultural experiment stations, the Lawes Chemical Manure Company became a model for American chemical fertilizer manufacturers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The papers that I consulted at Merle this summer have helped me begin to understand how these companies transformed between the 1920s and the 1950s as chemical recipes changed amidst the nitrogen revolution. I also made the trip to the London Archives, where I spent the day with the Gibbs & Son Company papers. It was Gibbs & Son Co. that was largely responsible for starting the guano trade in the 19th century. In fact, they held a monopoly over the Pacific guano trade for much of it, and they managed one of the mines that Ned Hodgson visited in Chile in 1908. In the summer of 2024, my wife and I took a trip to Peru. I could not resist the chance to drag her to the Guano Islands that lie to its south of Lima, some of the same islands that Ned had visited in 1908, where we took a boat to the Ballista Islands. It was there that we saw the hundreds and thousands of birds and other marine wildlife that contribute to the mounds of heaping fecal matter, what Gregory Cushman calls the vast fecal resources of the Pacific. In my pictures here from our trip, you can see the ruins of the docks and the other buildings that once housed Chinese migrant laborers who were brought there to harvest guano and loaded onto ships owned by Liverpool merchants who then sold it to American chemical manure manufacturers. When I returned to the UK in January for my second tour of duty with the UGA at Oxford program, I hope to revisit institutions like the National Archives at Kew, as well as the London Archives, to continue to dig deeper into these archival connections that I've already made. However, my primary focus will be writing the dissertation that I've been developing in the midst of making these maps. In the process of mapping the industry to better understand the Pratt process and its development, I also identified nearly 3 dozen new nuisance lawsuits filed against fertilizer factories that used Pratt's process between the 1880s and 1920. As I plan to argue in my dissertation, these cases provide a critical way for us to understand how the modernization of agriculture in the 20th century changed and reshaped the way Southerners understood their relationship to the environment. At the same time, it reshaped ecologies in both the U.S. South and the global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Andrew for pre-recording his talk. If anyone would like to pass on questions to Andrew, we will share our research email in the chat. We will also be doing this for Paul, as he has unfortunately been called away for the rest of this session. But if anyone would like to pop some questions into an email to our research address, then we will forward those on. I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Lakan Ajumu, who is a research associate at Archiving, Nigeria's leading community-driven digital archiving initiative. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of Ibadan and is currently a CWAR fellow at the University of Oxford. His research lies at the intersection of digital humanities, memory studies, environmental history, and African historiography, exploring how digital tools can preserve, reinterpret, and democratize Africa's past. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ita. Okay. Basically, my topic is on pollution memory, then also looking at the cocoa waste incidents that happened in Nigeria back in 1988. Back in 1988, there was a dumping of toxic waste in Nigeria by some Italian companies, and it was quite catastrophic to the level that it got. There were serious health and also like environmental implications. During the discovery, they found 10,000 barrels, 10,000 barrels of this waste that were dumped. The waste was dumped in the compound of a so-called man called Sunday Nana. And then when they carried out the research found that the barrels of toxic waste was filled with BCBs and dimethylamide and also these asbestos fibers that were corrosive solvents. And the newspaper headlines, because this research used basically newspapers from the archives. Interestingly, there was no official document that documented this issue. But what officials share documents I could not do, newspaper did it, because there are lots of papers back then that documented this particular this event. Some labeled it toxic danger, some labeled it hazardous films. So some even said this particular, what's it called, this waste and even get exploded. And also due to the toxicity of the waste, the government told the the people to leave. And interestingly, people who started having persistent headaches, burning eyesight, and breathing difficulties. In fact, there was a particular article I read that someone said that she could not sleep for 2 days because of the smell, and also probably there was an headache which people also had. And policemen were sent to the community, Coco, to checkmate people from not going near the particular site where these things were found. Interestingly, the policemen too were told to leave because they had health issues. In fact, several policemen began to fall sick. They began to say, oh, they had headaches, they had this, they had that, and they had to like withdraw them from the scene. And this was the first ever headline that talked about the toxic waste dump the cocoa. This is just a pictorial evidence of the waste, and also this is a closer look of the waste in Bende, and also this shows the large sizes of those packages. It shows that they were put in barrels and bags, and interestingly, police were told to pull out of the waste dump site because even for them it was getting very very dangerous, like wisely. And 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 interestingly, there were Japanese experts back in Nigeria that carried out a sort of research and found out that these wastes that were dumped were radioactive, and the news picked it up. And yeah, and also yeah, there was a danger warning to the cocoa residents. You are told to leave, like evacuate the community because it was not like conducive for them to stay in that particular community, and they began to flee. Many left the what's it called that that region, and also this was where people where those experts say that that waste might explode. In fact, this was part of the main reasons you are told to leave the community. And interestingly, add these are the lot of political lot of political I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. So these are the lot of like sort of political sorry medical defects because people started carrying out research because there were lots of people that went to the villages nearby trying to talk to people to say, oh, like how did you people feel concerning this particular toxic waste dumped, and they began to draw correlation between the health and also the dumping of the waste. And there's a particular article that talked about okay, yeah, so there's this particular paper here dissected the health effects and also like environmental effect of the cocoa waste that was dumped back in that community. And the Jew and the findings was that in the next couple of years, because due to the large number of waste and also the liquid that had dripped down, because this period was during the rainy season, and some containers were like open, and the waste with water had mixed together. Some had seeped down like into the soil, and they said that if care is not taken, that particular land, that community will become barren. And okay, yeah. So what happened next was a major scandal that engulfed not just not just within Nigeria itself, but with Italy, with the federal government carrying out a full scale launching to look at what actually happened. And mind you, during this period, it was the period of the military rule. So that tells you how delicate this situation was. Interestingly, there were some Nigerian students back in Italy that got to know about this, that we are carrying out daily protests, and Greenpeace, Greenpeace Italy too. We are we are we're like involved because they called for the Italian government to carry out thorough investigation concerning the group that dumped the waste in Nigeria, and also the EEC, European Economic Commission, to condemned the dumping of waste back in Nigeria, calling it toxic colonialism. And okay, and this is a paper that talks about the probe, saying, oh, that the Nigerian government was carrying out the probe, and this is a protest that was carried out by the Nigerian government, and also they took the battle to the United Nations. And also, okay, yeah, this was a paper that spoke about the continuation, and okay, and also this particular picture talks about the students themselves, the students that we are like involved, that felt that um that felt that this that what happened like in their country was not good enough. And this clipping are from some Italian papers that captured the news back then. Um, yeah, okay, okay. So this was the gradual ban on toxic waste dumping in Nigeria. And okay, so this was a clipping from the news that talked about the European Commission itself talking 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 on the waste dumping here in Nigeria, and there was this meeting that was carried out by the EEC to discuss how to mitigate the dumping, and there was serious global reverberations as there was a sort of diplomatic pressure that was on Italy to remove the waste, and also they said, okay, fine, that they would remove the waste since you are the ones that dumped it. And there was a particular clipping from the London Observer, which I will still show to you guys, that talks about the waste being dumped here in Nigeria. And okay, and that led to the Basel Convention, which was the first ever global convention to discuss the banning of dumping of toxic waste like anywhere. Okay, so due to the diplomatic issues, due to the diplomatic scandal, the federal military government recalled its its, its envoy from Italy. And okay, and there's this tussle between Nigeria and Italy. I said, okay, you will take the Italian government to the World Court, and yeah, they said they would definitely clear the waste. And yeah, they there was this what's it called, this move to start clearing the waste back from Nigeria. And this is the particular paper from the London Observer that talks about the waste dumping back in Nigeria. And when you read this particular article very well, it talks about it. It was a sort of embarrassment, and interestingly, the London Observer took the Italian government and also the company that dumped the waste to the cleaners. Um, then also okay, and there was okay. So this was where um, the the world met the world met at Bern to discuss the convention against the dumping of waste. And okay, so this takes us to memory and afterlife pollution in the archive. And so back in Nigeria, 2 years later, there was a law that was carried out, like a local law, to stop any form of waste being dumped here in Nigeria. And also this led and this what this law did was to plug in into the global convention, the law that was passed back in 1988 from Switzerland to discuss the global stopping ban of toxic waste. And also, this interview was gotten in 2018. This was 30 years after the cocoa waste. This is from the Punch newspaper, and this man spoke extensively concerning the waste, the effect of the waste, the toxic waste back in the community. The man said that the people are still feeling the effect, that prior to the waste being dumped, people The, um, the people living in the community were close to 10,000. But after that waste dumping, that people moved and people couldn't even come back. And the particular compound that the waste was dumped, the grasses there, the trees there are still like barren. They've turned to a desert. And also, like unfortunately, the water from the drum seeped into a nearby river, and that water has been contaminated. And for years, for 30 years, nobody would drink the water. That that even the fishes there had been destroyed. And and okay, so basically these are some cartoons I found from the archives that spoke into the what's it called event. There's this police officer that was accusing another one saying, "How dare you accuse me? It is not my duty to check goods. It is your fault in the first place. You allowed the goods in. Admit it." So question mark is who did it? And also, there's this interesting cartoon about a man who is pouring toxic waste. The man by the right signifies Italy. The police officer there signifies Nigeria and legal action and likes. And there's this notice for people who are quite familiar back in Nigeria. You will see notice on the wall: do not urinate here, do not defecate here. This is a perfect caricature that talks about it, that says don't urinate or discharge your waste here. So there's a man here pouring, the man signifies Italy and dumping toxic waste. And another here he says, oh, smell, come back here and clear this rubbish. And okay, so conclusively, my argument is that newspaper makes pollution visible as a lived crisis, capturing fear, confusion, and also environmental harm as it unfolded in real time. They preserve pollution as a memory, showing how narratives of blame, suffering, and survival evolve long after the event. They document pollution as governance, tracing how states, international bodies, and legal regimes respond to the form of fuel. They function as polluted archives themselves, shaped by politics, sensationalism, contradictions, and uneven survival records. The Cocoa incident reveals how a local toxic dump became a global turning point, driving the Nigeria's environmental reform and, and influencing international regulation. Interestingly, this was not the only dumping that happened at this period. Pari passu with the dumping with Nigeria, some countries too were dumping waste in Venezuela. In fact, there was an there was an European country, I think from the Scandinavians, that dumped some waste in Benin Republic, in Guinea-Bissau, and also Senegal, which I found from the archives. Interestingly, these papers are quite much. And like this is a large data set which I scanned. There are a lot, like a lot. But I just like had to just cut few that talks that that speaks into this particular presentation I want to do. Thank you very much, and I hope you've been able to learn one or two from my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laikan. That was excellent. I'm really pleased to see how many sources you found there. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But if anyone else has any questions from our final presentation of today, please do put those into the Q&A button at the bottom and I'll pick those up. I wonder if I could take the chair's privilege and ask you one question based on that last presentation. Because we talked a little bit yesterday about the sort of particular challenge of using archives to search for topics around pollution, because often these records are kept so secret or even completely closed to access. It seems like you found a lot of useful materials in those newspaper collections, particularly those cartoons were really interesting. Did you find any aspects of this research challenging, or was it quite easy to find the records that you needed?
Yes, because the most interesting part was that there was a day when I was just just scrolling online. There was a page that posted this particular cocoa story. They just posted it randomly, and to me it felt interesting. To be sincere, that was the first time that I would hear such a thing happen in Nigeria. That some people dumped a large amount of toxic waste in Nigeria. And that piqued my own interest. So I made a Google search, but the result I got didn't match my curiosity because when it comes to contemporary times, it was not well documented. But I tracked the date and the month it happened, the date, the year, month, and the year it happened. So basically, I just went to the archives, just read it briefly, I just left. Interestingly, when I saw the call for papers from Q archives, my mind just went back to the cocoa waste back in the library. So basically, what I did was to go back. This time, I sat down and I went through different. I think I went through five newspapers: Daily Times, The Guardian, Punch, Tribune, and Vanguard to see different perspective when it comes to the reportage. And interestingly, that period, this was a major big deal for Nigerians because a lot of Nigerians were writing articles, opinion pieces, columns concerning this particular episode. So there was a robust there's this robust information. If you go to the newspapers section, you will find a lot of events, a lot of news about it. But interestingly, we can't find documentations from the government itself, like official documentations. You can't find them. But like I said earlier, what was missing from official documentation, the archives, the libraries, especially newspaper reportage, they served that bridge because they documented. There are lots of reports, like there are editorials, opinion pieces. There are write-ups from medical experts talking about the environmental effects and also the medical effects. In fact, a lot of environmentalists came out to discuss about the effect of this waste dumping in like on Nigerian soil, and it was quite interesting. Very, 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 very interesting story and event to like on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to hear a bit more about your sort of journey to finding these records and how you came to put together this piece of research.
Yeah, thank you very much.
We do have one question for you in the chat, which is from Gary Willis, which I'll pose to you now. So Gary's asking about the role of newspapers. So he says, if Nigerian papers are anything similar to British papers, then they each have their own political and social agendas. So did they have the same response to the issue across the whole sort of wide spectrum of the media, or were there certain papers that were more interested or critical than others?
Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, so basically, like I said, there are five papers that I checked out, five different papers, just to like analyze the way they reported. The most critical of them was the Daily Times. Daily Times was critical about the dumping, and interestingly, the Guardian was quite critical because of they critique the government more because they spoke more from the point of the government not not doing more to safeguard borders. They get and that was why for me getting different papers was very very important to gauge perspective and opinion, so that to a very large extent we can have a sort of balanced what's it called a balanced presentation. So yes, some are critical of the government, while some are critical of Italy. Some went to for the jugular, condemning what Italy had done, developing nomenclatures like toxic, toxic colonialism and the likes. And they are like, oh, what the Italian government did was bad. What the Italian company did was very, very bad. But there are some papers that felt that, okay, fine, the Nigerian government should have done better to safeguard borders. They would have done better to make sure those things didn't come through the borders in the first place. So yes, some papers were critical of Italy, while some were critical of the Nigerian government itself. Despite, number one, despite the fact that the Nigerian government back then was a military rule, there are still some people who are firebrand who still felt the Nigerian government didn't do enough to safeguard the lives of Nigerians. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. If anyone else has any questions, please do put them in the chat. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you one more question since we have a few minutes spare, which slightly follows on from what you were just saying. But I'm just wondering how much international involvement and international media responses were important to sort of making the incident visible. I'm thinking particularly about when you were talking about Greenpeace and their involvement. I think it was Italian involvement that you mentioned. I'm just wondering whether you think the sort of international viewpoint on the incident was kind of the stepping stone towards the legal changes that were made, or if you think that might have happened from internally from the government. We seem to have lost Lekan, so I will give him a few moments to return, and hopefully he'll be able to join us again. Sorry, I think you dropped out for a moment there.
Yeah. Sorry, please.
You catch my question?
Can you come back with that question? That question again. Can you come back with? Can you?
Yes. I will repeat, no problem at all. I'll keep it quite brief, but the question was basically, do you think that the international response and sort of media coverage of the incident was important to making it visible, or if that would have eventually come from, internally?
Okay. Yeah, that's quite an interesting question because I thought about it too when they met in Switzerland to discuss the convention concerning banning toxic waste. My question was that what made them be swift about carrying out this convention? Was it because of the pressure that was placed by the Nigerian government, or probably because there was something else? Interestingly, that period, the United States themselves, they were quite invested. In fact, the US said they would help Italy to carry the waste from Nigeria back to Italy. But the Nigerian government said no, that they want the Italians themselves to take the waste themselves because they are the ones that dumped it. From what I've read so far and from what I've seen, I think it was the major pressure. And let me remind you that at that period too, we witnessed dumping in Venezuela. There was a dumping in Venezuela that the Venezuela government, because of the pressure from Nigeria, they felt no, you can't dump this waste here too in our country. And that period too, a lot of countries from Benin Republic to Guinea-Bissau to Niger and some other African countries too, waste were being dumped in their own countries. So this has led to a sort of international uproar in which Nigeria took the lead. And to a very, 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 very large extent, that led to the convention being held in in Switzerland. And interestingly, the British media took it up. And New York Times wrote extensively about the dumping. And like once it gets to New York Times, it has become a global issue. So New York Times wrote extensively on it. I didn't put a clip in there. The BBC came to Nigeria to interview the reporter, the first reporter that reported it. The BBC were on ground in Nigeria, and the London, I think London Observer too, they wrote a good piece about it. So media coverage, political pressure was what led to other countries taking note of the issue and saying, okay, fine, we need to sit down today and draft a global convention to ban the dumping of toxic waste in the global south.
That's Great. Thanks for giving a bit more detail on that. I'm going to wrap up the Q&A session there. So thank you very much for taking the time to answer those questions. And thank you to all of our panelists from this first session. We're now going to take a break and we'll come back again at 3:30 UK time. So please join us again there. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to our second online panel of Talking Records Pollution in the Archive. This panel is titled Preserving the Past, Protecting the Future. Unfortunately, our final speaker for this afternoon is unable to present today, but we do have two more speakers who will explore this topic of environmental accountability when researching and preserving archival records. This session will therefore end at around 4:15. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Tushar Kant, who is a designer and researcher trained in digital humanities. His practice blends systems thinking, storytelling, and humanity-centered design to create tools and narratives that support communities, learning, and ecological well-being. He's especially interested in how design shapes social and ecological futures, and his talk will be on designing digital archives with ecological accountability. Over to you. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Heather. And let me share my screen. Hope that's visible. Okay. Just a second. So, hi, greetings everyone. Thank you for being here. And I just want to start with a question that is very fundamental to our field, yet easy to overlook. So, what if the system we rely on to preserve memory are far more material, like more energy hungry, even more ecologically demanding than we currently assume? And that's why we are here today to explore what it means to design digital archives with ecological accountability. Let's begin with the Act 1, the illusion. And when we think about digital preservation, most of us carry the same picture in our heads. It's the cloud, a soft, weightless place where our files somehow live forever, and it feels clean, it feels weightless, and even infinite. And this powerful metaphor has shaped our discourse, our design choices, and even our justification for migrating away from physical media. But as comforting as that story is, it doesn't tell you the whole truth. And the gap between this weightless narrative and the material reality is precisely where our ecological accountability must begin. Um, so we often talk about pollution in the archive, that may be acidic paper, degrading film, etc. But we must now confront that the pollution of the archive, like the environmental pressure that has been created by the very infrastructure that enable digital preservation. And this is very real and measurable material reality that underpins every digital record we store. And understanding that critical shift from pollution inside the archive to pollution created by the archive is the first step in thinking ecologically about preservation. To move from this metaphor to reality, we must ground our discussion in various costs of digital preservation, and that's where the Act 2 is starting. First one is the energy, and for that, let's ground this in data. And everything we store online lives inside machines that run constantly, day and night, without any pause. The carbon footprint of this infrastructure is significant, and data storage and transmission releases approximately 330 megaton of carbon dioxide annually. And to put that into perspective, this comes to roughly 2% of global emissions, and a figure comparable to the entire global aviation sector. And this footprint is not generated by a single dramatic event, but by the ordinary, continuous action of our systems, migrating files, running backups, executing searches, and maintaining constant availability. So each small actions draws energy and collectively creating a substantial footprint that sits quietly behind every digital record we preserve. Second comes the water, another critical but often overlooked component. Every server generates heat, and maintaining stable operating temperature requires a massive steady flow of water. In the United States alone, the indirect water footprint of data center reached an estimated 211 billion gallons in 2023, sorry. Furthermore, a recent Morgan Stanley report suggests that global water use for data center could grow 11-fold by 2018, driven largely by the demands of generative AI. And all of that water comes from the river farms and from local ecosystems that are already under pressure. So even the idea of instant access depends on something very physical, and that's a constant supply of water, keeping the digital world cool enough to function. Third, the material, and that's the hardware itself, the server, the cable, the devices, and all of it is built from mined rare earth metals and other materials taken from the ground. In 2022, the world generated 62 million tons of e-waste, an increase of about 82% since 2010, and most of that waste never enters safe recycling systems. Only around 22% is processed through proper channels. So even though digital preservation feel immaterial, it isn't. It tied to material extraction, to manufacturing, to the chemical and ecological system that make the hardware possible. And when you store these data, it's worth remembering preservation always has a material footprint. So when you zoom out, the digital archives looks nothing like the cloud we imagine. It is embedded within a global physical network, undersea cables stretching across oceans, data center spread across continents, and the power grids, cooling system that sustain them. It is a vast, interconnected infrastructure built layer by layer, carrying our collective memory across the planet. The archive is not a floating above the world. It is rooted deep within it. And this means it inherently carries environmental needs and the consequences. So the central question is, if this is the material reality underneath the interface, what can design do to mediate it? That leads us to the Act 3, the ethical design. So before we move into the broader design ideas, I want to pause on something familiar, the dark mode. We usually think of it as a visual preference or rather a matter of comfort. However, on modern OLED displays, dark interfaces generally use less energy and power because each pixel emits its own light. And this simple shift can reduce energy consumption by 30 to 40%. Dark mode reminds us that interface design isn't just aesthetic, and the way we design interfaces can influence how much energy they use. It is one of the reasons this presentation uses mostly black, and it's a small gesture, but also a reminder that even simple visual decisions participate in an ecological conservation. So as we move forward, the question shifts from how do we preserve to how do we design in ways that support better preservation. And we are not starting from zero. Significant work is already underway. Organizations like Clocks, working with the DIMPAC initiative, have successfully mapped the carbon footprint of their preservation services. BBC has partnered with organizations such as Carbon Trust to access the carbon impact of their streaming services. Several other organizations have started moving in this direction, from reducing bandwidth and energy use to experiment with internal dashboards that make their power consumption visible. Uh, this tells us that measurement exists and the method and knowledge about it also exist. But the next crucial step is not just measurement, it is design. And it is finding ways to make these environmental costs visible and meaningful to the people who interact with digital archives every day. Starting from intervention one, visibility. So one simple place to begin it is with visibility. And so for that, what if every search or download carries a simple, small, estimated carbon cost? Nothing intrusive, just a quiet number beside the action, much like as we see file sizes or even the loading times. That small piece of information creates a gentle movement for awareness before we act. And it is not to discourage use, but to help us understand that access has a footprint just like everything else. And design doesn't need to warn or shame. Sometimes it only needs to reveal what is already there. Even that small shift can fundamentally change how people perceive their everyday interactions with the digital archive. Next, we have the second intervention and the metadata, and which already tells us a lot: who created the record, where it came from, how been handled, and what format it's in. So it is a small stretch to imagine metadata carrying one more piece of information, and that's the energy intensity of storing or accessing the file. In the archival world, we already use preservation metadata to determine storage styles. For example, moving low access files to cold storage, sorry. We propose extending this to include fields that describe storage intensity and even energy class alongside the file or format. It's a small change, but it shifts environmental costs from something invisible to something that quietly becomes an integral part of how a record is understood and even managed. Third intervention is the lighter options, and this is the another simple place where design can make a difference, offering a lighter, lower impact options. And versions of this already exist in the tools many people use every day. Adobe applications offer users and prompt them to export files in smaller, even optimized formats. Google Photos also offers like storage optimization options that can automatically compress images and videos. And platforms like Unsplash let people choose between different file resolutions, which lower bandwidth without limiting access. Bringing this thinking into digital archives mean offering meaningful, transparent choices like standard access versus low energy access, compressed downloads, or even group requests. These are not restrictions, they are thoughtful alternatives that allow users to navigate the archives in ways that are lighter on the system while remaining fully usable. Intervention 4, let's address the quiet reality of digital preservation, that is redundancy. And to keep a file safe, we store it multiple copies across different regions and systems, and this duplication is essential, but each additional copy adds to the system's environmental footprint. Right now, this is invisible. A user sees a single file, not the 4 or 5 replica, consuming energy, cooling, and hardware resources. A simple line, 5 copies across 3 regions, is enough to shift this understanding. It helps user and archivist understand and even recognize that preservation is material. Once redundancy is visible, the information become actionable, and the archivist and institution can make more informed decision about storage style, reducing duplications for low risk collections, or even shifting replicas into lower carbon regions. And interfaces can offer lower impact access paths, like serving from the closest region or using fewer replicas for non-critical queries. This indicates builds environmental literacy directly into the interface and helps institution aligning this preservation decision with ecological accountability. As we close, I want to return to our core commitment. Preservation is not only about protecting the past, it is about a commitment to the ecological conditions that allow memory to survive in the future. Everything we have discussed today reminds us that digital archives are not outside the natural world. They are built from it, powered by it, cooled by it, and even dependent on it. So the question that matters now is not just technical, it is ethical. What kind of archives do we choose to build, and what environmental and human cost come with those choices? I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tushar. That was great. Yeah, it's really interesting to have your paper here because it sort of reminds us of the links between the content of the archival records that we're looking at in terms of histories of pollution and how they're always linked to the ways of using them as archivists and researchers. So I'm sure we'll come back to that in the Q&A portion. And just a reminder on that note to everyone to please put any questions that you have into the Q&A chat now at the bottom. Next, we will move on to our final talk for today, which is also pre-recorded. This is from Dr. Taimash Khan, who is a senior instructor and university archivist at the Aga Khan University in Pakistan, where he manages the global archives and special collections across campuses in East Africa, Europe, and South Asia. He focuses on paper preservation, digitization, and wider public access to archival material. He previously served as Deputy Director of Archives at NUST Islamabad and worked with the Department of Archaeology and Museums for the Government of Pakistan. He teaches and leads training in archival practice and digital preservation, and his work builds practical systems that strengthen research, safeguard records, and support long-term institutional memory. We will now hear his pre-recorded talk on visualizing pollution and the challenges of archival preservation in developing countries. Lessons from Pakistan.
Everyone, good afternoon. So I will speak about how archives in developing countries record pollution and how they also suffer from it. My focus is in Pakistan with examples from Sindh Archives in Karachi, which is a regional archive. These records help us understand how pollution shapes society, yet the archives that protect them face serious environmental risk of their own. Photographs, maps, and state reports document the effects of industrial growth and rapid urban change. These resources show polluted waterways, unplanned settlements, waste sites, and the rise of respiratory diseases in Karachi and other major cities of Pakistan. They help researchers track the impact of environmental stress on public health and governance. Karachi expanded at high speed in the 20th century. Industrial hubs grew close to the residential areas. The archives contain visual and written evidence that captures these shifts throughout the last few years. They show how pollution became a daily part of our life. They also show how local authorities struggled to regulate it and how citizens responded. The same environment that pollution created now threatens the archive. In Sindh archives, paper files, photographic negatives, and prints show damage from humidity, elevated temperatures, dust, and even insects activity. These climate conditions combined with weak storage and understaffing, this produced slow but a steady deterioration process within our archives. So if we talk about shared challenges within the developing countries, these risks are not limited to Pakistan. Across many developing countries, archives struggles with the same pressures. Usually the funding for preservation is very low. Conservators or the trained staff are very few in number. The buildings where archives are housed are not designed for long-term preservation. And the climate change increases heat and moisture every year. So these records, they remain exposed to slow decay. So the key argument here is the need for a double perspective. Archives give us evidence of polluted environments. At the same time, they are shaped by those same environment. They are both witness and victim. Their own condition becomes part of the story of environmental stress in the global south. And also, if these archives continue to decay, researchers will lose evidence of how pollution shaped cities and communities. These records are needed for environmental history, for public memory, and for policy studies. Without intervention, many materials will not survive long enough for future analysis. Preservation strategies must suit local conditions. Climate control needs realistic solutions that can work within our limited budgets. Staff needs practical training in stabilizing damaged paper and photographic material. Small upgrades such as basic environmental monitoring and insect pest management can also slow down deterioration and protect these valuable collections. So to sum it up, Pakistan's case show the need for stable investment, more trained conservators, and stronger institutional support. Archives must be seen as essential infrastructure for understanding the past. Protecting them will allow future generations to study the environmental history of South Asia with a more reliable and authentic evidence. So in conclusion, archives document how pollution shapes society, and they also reveal how environmental stress shapes the archive itself. These collections hold evidence that no other source can replace. If they continue to weaken, entire chapters of environmental, social, and administrative history will become harder to study. Protecting them is not only a technical task, but rather it's a commitment to future scholarship and public memory. Their survival will decide which stories remain available to the future researchers and which disappear. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you again to Temash for that pre-recorded talk. So that brings us to the end of our talks for today. So now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of this panel. So please do put any more questions that you have for Tushar in particular into the chat, into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, sorry. And if we have any other questions, do feel free to put those into the Q&A as well, and we'll pass those on to the speakers who aren't with us today. First question that we already have in the chat that I'd like to present to Tushar is, this is from Catherine Miller, who says, thanks for your talk. I wondered if your research also, for comparison, looked at what is the carbon impact of searches by academic archivists in comparison to those made by the general public.
That's a great question for the first, I'll say. And so the thing is, environment doesn't differentiate who is the person who is doing the stuff. So I didn't differentiate between the archivist searches or even public searches in particular. But the thing is, environmental impact comes from who is not come from like who is searching, but moreover comes from the architecture that enable the searches or even the handling of the any work. So what is interesting in that question is that it is the difference in pattern of uses. You can say like archivists like more often perform more complex or even metadata heavy tasks, and public users might perform like very lightweight or even like exploratory one, like just going for searches and just looking at it. So even the like patterns differ, but the ethical questions remains the same, like the infrastructure is there for even whoever the user is. So rather than separating the archivist from the public, I'm arguing that I'm just trying to build a system or design a system where every search become part of more accountable and even transparent ecological practices. So hope I have answered your question.
Great, thank you. I'll take us on to our next question that we have in the Q&A, which is from Gary Willis again. Thank you for the question. He says, that's very thought-provoking. And to what extent, if any, is this issue on the agenda of governments and IT industries?
Oh, thank you. And that's very important question to ask. And because of these huge infrastructure that are like in there for the archives and even data centers. We are seeing like early movements, but I can't say very even movements. There are some industry, if you look at the industry side of it, the big giants like Google, AWS, and Microsoft are trying to publish their carbon intensity data centers and even like workloads of their servers. But I think it's on very early stages. But I think when you try to look at it in more visible sense, people will look at it in overall as a impactful situation, and they will try to like understand it and even look for options that can be more sustainable on the longer run. So can't say much, but hope my this presentation might provoke any kind of discussion and even future conversations on this kind of ecological accountability. So yeah.
Thank you. I actually have a question that follows on a little from that in the context of thinking about the owners of these digital tools, and the wider IT industry, and how often the impact, sort of the information that gives us the knowledge of the impact of these tools is kind of withheld from us, or we're only given parts of that information. So I'm going back to your slide about the carbon footprint notification of the impact of your searching. We often discuss the problematic elements of the idea of a carbon footprint and how that puts the onus on the individual rather than large-scale organizations and industries. But do you think that it is more justified to use carbon footprint sort of tools in this digital context, since, like you say, it helps give us kind of this real world sense of the impact we're having and not just this magical cloud of information? It's a bit
Right.
long-winded, but I hope you got my point there.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm not trying to put the whole conversation onto the user. There are everyone involved in this situation, and I hope the more impact comes from the you can say architectural rebalance of things. Like if the server uses less power, even for a larger kind of data, I believe that is more of a quick solution to a more sustainable future. Even if a user searches for like 10 queries and the server uses like less amount of carbon, less amount of power, so that will be a greater impact. But I don't know right now what is happening with the industry standards. But to see that happen, we have to look forward to it. And I'm just trying to start that conversation in that direction so that people see that impact. And even I believe Apple has started something like this. Not sure how much they are trying to do, but they are trying to make their servers like carbon neutral. It's
Mhm.
like they are trying to do it for like 2030 or something around that time period, but they are trying it. And I want just to make that visible to all the world, not just the user, the industry, the governments, and everyone in the situation, because we are all facing the same environmental impacts, not only the industry and not only the user. So yeah, hope I answered your question.
Oh, that's really useful. I think, yeah, sort of focusing on this idea of visibility and making sure that that visibility is shared with everyone
Yeah.
from the large industry to the user is a really good point. Thank you. We do have one more question for you in the Q&A. This is Tracy Hayes, who says, thank you very much for the interesting talk. Do ecological considerations increasingly affect what you choose to not preserve or preserve? She puts not in brackets. In the future, will archives consider not preserving certain things to reduce their carbon emissions and/or use of water?
Oh, that's a very sensitive question to ask. But right now, what I believe is ecological consideration are not something we should decide um, what we should preserve and what we shouldn't. And I don't think the future of ecological accountability lies in refusing to preserve things. Um, the selection process always have been guided by the cultural values, even the rights, even the risks, and even the community priorities. So I believe that principle should be remain central, even looking out for the ecological accountability. And where ecological thinking does not have a role in limiting the memory, but it is just reshaping the system that hold it all. So I don't see ecological accountability as a call to preserve less. I see it as a call to preserve more responsibly. Like, so the question does not say like we shouldn't preserve, but it's like uh, how do we preserve in ways that honors like better ecological future for to per se. So hope I was like good for the question.
I think that's a great answer to a very complex question, and particularly as we're speaking from the National Archives today in the UK.
Thank you.
We don't have any further questions in the chat, so I think we will wrap up the Q&A portion there. But thank you very much for taking those questions, and we much appreciate your talk. So I'll just move on to a few final comments before we finish up for the day. So thank you to all of our speakers for sharing your research and insights into pollution in the archive. And thank you very much to our audience for joining us. We'd be really grateful if you could complete a quick evaluation survey that we'll be sharing shortly with you by email. And we hope that you've been inspired by our Talking Records series to explore pollution histories in the archive and how these intersect with wider environmental histories and methods of preserving collections for the future. So have a great weekend, everyone, and we really hope to see you at future research events and at next year's Talking Records Symposium. Bye.